It was probably the hardest growth I've ever had to go through. We had no money, essentially, really, before this. This was the biggest deal in the entire world. Like, when we found out, I literally kissed the ground.
You just heard from Neil Parikh. At 12 years old, he was selling cigarettes out of his dad's store on the Rutgers campus. At 29, he exited his company for hundreds of millions of dollars. Today, I had him on the show to learn how he went from dropping out of medical school.
So I told my parents, hey, I'm going to take a year off. I'm going to move to New York City and I'm going to figure something else off.
To building a $500 million company. But before we begin, I have one quick favor to ask you. If you are enjoying these interviews, I'd love it if you subscribe down below. The bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests we can have on the show. Thank you very much. And now onto my conversation with Neil Parikh. Neil, thanks for joining. Before we get into your journey co-founding a $1 billion company, I believe our early years are fundamental in shaping the person we become. Are there any patterns or things that you did in your early years that you would consider an anomaly that led you to the person you are today?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. I didn't know this at the time because I would probably complain about it all the time. But when I was a kid, I grew up in New Brunswick, and my grandfather owned a convenience store on the Rutgers campus on Easton Avenue. And pretty much every day I'd go work in the store. And, he'd teach me about packing boxes, taking inventory. I was probably selling cigarettes, which I don't think kids should have been doing, all kinds of like funny things. But it wasn't until much later in my life that I realized that what that experience was teaching me about the physics of business, right? That you have to buy things at a certain price. You have to sell them at a price that's higher than you bought them for. You have to make money on margins. You have to treat your employees well. You have to form a community of people who are influencers. So we'd always have professors from the college campus come in, and my grandfather would always treat them super well, or the police officers, because he knew they would bring in other people. And so I sometimes look back on that experience because at the time I was like, why do I have to be here and work in this store? But it was actually probably one of the most profound experiences for me later, because I think it really taught me the basics of business, even if it was in a really small way.
And how did you use that experience in that foundational basics of business later on when you started your first company?
Well, I'd say it took me a long time to understand how business works, to be totally honest, right? Like in college, I tried starting nonprofits where we help people get access to clean water in India. And we tried to build micro entrepreneurs that would build little stations inside of slums that would sell water filters. My first experience was actually enabling people to set up stores and resell stuff. And then over time, once we kind of started thinking about e-commerce and realized, wow, we can actually get other people to sell stuff on our behalf, we started a startup called Consigned, where it was kind of like an influencer marketplace, where if you were an influencer and you wanted to sell watches, you could consign somebody. If I owned a Rolex, I could consign it to somebody else who would sell it to their audience, but it was too complicated. And so I think over time, it just got me thinking about this relationship between people, how things are bought and sold. And really a lot of it's just how does human psychology work,
I think those foundational lessons were kind of key to when you started, I guess, the big company, which we're here to talk about, which is Casper. Casper currently had 5 co-founders. How did you all meet and come up with the idea for creating a mattress company online and selling mattresses online?
Yeah, I think my favorite quote or story is that these things only make sense in reverse, So what happened is I was first in medical school at Brown, and I thought I was going to be a doctor. And after my first year, the thing about medical school is that it's a place where at that time, they're not really looking for super innovative students, right? They're mostly memorize stuff, get it done, go do your homework, come back and take a test. It's like the army. And that didn't resonate very well with me. So I told my parents, hey, I'm going to take a year off. I'm going to move to New York City and I'm going to figure something else off. So first of all, they had a heart attack. My parents called me, turned blue in the face. They were very upset about the fact because they thought I might never go back to medical school, which I didn't. But so what happened is I moved to New York, and with some of my friends from undergrad who had just graduated, we ended up starting a series of companies, one of them being Consigned, which I just told you about. And we were actually in an accelerator program in New York City at a co-working space where I happened to sit next to, by chance, somebody who became my friend named Philip. And one day I heard him talking about how he used to sell mattresses online from his dorm room. And I'm like, that's such a dumb idea. Like, who's ever going to buy a mattress on the internet? Like, don't you have to try it before you buy it? But my dad was actually a sleep doctor. And so I guess I'd been thinking about this stuff. I've been in medicine. I was thinking about the, consumer applications of what could happen if you think about, healthcare and e-commerce. And so we realized together that there was a moment in time where there were going to be all these industries that could be disruptive. And I think sometimes when businesses often happen at like the right moment in time. So we saw Warby Parker and we saw Harry's and we said, that's funny. Mattresses are like a terrible industry. You have to like negotiate. Back then you had to like negotiate with some guy inside of a store that's like he wears like a large suit, and it's like you go buy a mattress and like you have to negotiate on the price. Like, what other object? Like, we go buy this water, you don't go say like, no, I'm going to pay 80 cents for it, but you'd have to negotiate on a mattress price. So we said, what if we could totally improve the experience? But more important than that, what if we could build the Nike of sleep, where we could figure out how to create products and services and other things that could help people take sleep more seriously, make it cool, make it interesting. And so we started with a mattress, and then we ended up, over time getting into many other categories, and the co-founding journey kind of evolved with that.
Gotcha. And when you started the business, you were actually so confident in your ability to impact the $39 billion mattress industry. So you go to raise money from investors, and after meeting with dozens of investors, what was the feedback from them? What were you hearing?
Oh my God. It's so funny because we were like, this is a genius idea. This is of course it's going to work. And so then we start pitching investors, and one by one, it's like dominoes falling, but like in a bad way. Everybody's like, nobody's ever going to buy a mattress on the internet, right? The feedback was, nobody's going to do this. This doesn't seem like a good idea. You have to try a product before you buy it. The economics are never going to work. The mattress industry is super sketchy. And back then, to be fair, direct-to-consumer wasn't really a category. Still, Warby and Harry's were in their early days, and people kind of thought this was a crazy bet. And so we probably had 50 meetings of all no's before we got to our first yes.
At the very beginning, I saw this picture, which I think is pretty important from when you were trying to get investors. You gave a Casper mattress to a now well-known investor, Ben Lehrer, and stored his old mattress until he was convinced that he wanted to keep the new one. What story does that picture share?
Okay, so this is what happened. So we met Ben, and Ben had actually been thinking about this category for a while and had tried, I think, starting this company in a different way, and it hadn't worked. So when we met, he was the first person that was like, I get it. Okay, so we're super excited. He's like, I want to lead you around. I want to invest, and I'm going to write, I think it was a $400,000 check. And this was the biggest deal in the entire world. Like, when we found out, I literally kissed the ground because we had no money, essentially, really before this, alongside of maybe some angels and our friend Ron, who said he was going to invest. But Ben's one stipulation was, can I try the bed before I say yes? Because I want to make sure it's good. Okay, now here's the thing. We didn't really have a lot of production beds. We only had some little samples and stuff. But of course, he's an investor. You're like, yeah, of course. So we overnight a bed from our factory. We get it sent. And then we're like, but we don't have it we hadn't built the compression machines yet that kind of get it into the Casper box that you see today. So we're like, how are we going to get it into his house? Okay, so we rent a U-Haul. We put the mattress inside from our office in Soho. We drive to his house, and we go up into his Soho loft, and we see his wife there. And we're like, hey, we're here to install the mattress. And she thinks, we're the mattress delivery guys. So she's like, all right, cool. Yeah, it's in the back. You can go do it. So we go put the mattress in. And of course, right as I'm swinging the mattress around, we knock over one of his lamps. It falls on the ground. I'm going, oh my God, this is a disaster. And so we install the mattress. And then the other photo here is we took away his old one. But the thing we didn't realize was we didn't have a place to store it. So we threw away his old mattress, and we prayed that he was going to like it, because if he didn't like it and he wanted his old bed back, we had no other options. And so we kind of didn't sleep that night hoping that he was going to have a good experience and that him and his wife were going to have a good experience. And then luckily the next day or 2 days later, we get an email that just says like amazing in all caps, caps, caps. And then we knew it was going to happen. And we knew that like the round was going to happen. But it was probably the most stressful few days of our life.
You said before that you didn't really have any money and you actually had to take out debt to start the business. How much debt did you guys have to take out?
I want to say we probably had 50 to 100,000 in credit card loans between us. It was kind of like a revolving, like anybody who had some amount of credit, we'd take it out. And to be fair, Philip was the oldest. And so he had by far the best credit. And so a lot of it sat on him. But I'd say that, we were continuously just putting things on either our credit cards or we'd go to suppliers and say, hey, we'll pay you in 3 months. Wink, wink. We don't really have the money right now. But it really took a lot of people to believe on us from the beginning.
Did having that much debt in the beginning, did that stress you guys out?
Yes, but I don't think we really thought about it. I think you have to have just this like eternal optimism that it's going to be fine, And so I think because we were working so quickly and there was momentum, we just didn't really think about it too much. And then luckily what happened is that from the time we had racked up that debt to the time we got money was probably only 4 to 6 months later. And so we were able to kind of get rid of it relatively quickly and switch it on. But yeah, I mean, look, if we hadn't raised the money, we'd probably be sitting here having a very different conversation today.
And when you were going up to investors and they were saying this was a dumb idea, a lot of them were saying that. One person gave you a chance. What was something you learned from those rejections from the investors?
For one, look, later, of course, I wanted to be spiteful and say, haha, I knew it. And you know what, you didn't believe in us. And you always want to take those things, like sometimes it feels good to take it personally, like it's an affront and it can be motivating. But the reality is, like looking back on it, because now I'm sure I've passed on investing in many companies that ended up becoming huge. It's like so much of this is just time and place and somebody's mindset and their unpersonal experiences with something. And so like, I think my lesson was like, just don't take that stuff super personally, like it's a numbers game. You just have to get out there and put in reps and you're going to keep getting better at telling your story over and over again. And if you want to raise a few $1,000,000, you might need to have a few hundred conversations, but like, it's a really good test to see if you have the resilience for the other stuff that's going to happen later in your business, because like raising money is hard, but it's definitely not as hard as all the other stuff you're going to have to do one day.
Yeah. The story component, how did that story of Casper evolve from when you were pitching investors to then a few years down the line when you started to sell mattresses and stuff?
Yeah. So for one, we changed the name. The original name was called Dukes. And when we first started pitching the business, we had a different name. It was a bad pun, but basically we said that, mattresses have sizes in queens and kings, and we wanted to be the Rogue Duke. And so we called it Dukes. Now, the problem is this made sense to nobody until we told the story. And we couldn't get Duke.com because I think it belongs to some energy company. So the brand changed, the name changed, but not that much about the core story of who we wanted to be actually changed. We always wanted to be a sleep company. We always said we're actually going to launch lots of products and services related to sleep, and that mattresses would be our first way in, but that we would very quickly follow with lots of other products in that. And so I think what happened is that as we kept meeting investors over and over again, and some of the, the person who ended up leading our Series A, Tony Florence at NEA and Amit, we'd actually met them in the seed round and they'd passed on us and said, this is too early. But by the time we met them again, 6 or 12 months later, and they had seen some of the progress, they, you get a chance to, they get this like reference point. They say, oh, wow, like I've seen the story and how they say it's going to play out. And it actually played out the way they said it was going to. And so I think that like some consistency to your story is actually pretty important.
And after you got the $400K investment, you get a cash injection into your bank account. What was next for Casper and the team?
The first thing we did the day the money closed is we bought ourselves MacBooks. So we went to the Apple store because we had been working on these like really podunk computers that like sucked. And so we got everybody a like one of those like massive Mac displays and a really nice MacBook, and like it was kind of a weird gift to ourselves because it was just so we could work more, but we were so excited that day about it. But really what happened is we set up the basics of our team. So April 22nd, 2014 is when we launched. We closed the round a few months earlier than that. And so what we needed to do is get the supply chain set up, get the branding done, get the packaging done, get the website built, do our early marketing, and then set up a lot of the logistics and infrastructure so we could do same day deliveries, all that stuff. And we hired out an early team. So we had a head of PR, a head of performance marketing, a head of customer service, a head of engineering. And so we had a few people that joined us pre-launch in addition to the founders. And a lot of it was just like getting that stuff set up. We had hired a PR agency that helped us with our launch. And so a lot of the funds went towards, kind of like setting everything up so we could have one big explosive launch day.
And during that launch day, you guys sold 139 beds on the first day, immediately resulting in a supply chain shortage. How did you get that initial traction?
Okay, so we had bought, I think, actually only 40 or 50 beds because we thought they would last for a few months. And so we had no idea this was going to happen, right? We were like, okay, like a good day would be we sell 10, 20 of these things. And so for one, in that time period, there weren't that many cool DTC companies launching. And so PR was a very powerful tool to be able to get the word out. And so we leaned very heavily into earned media. And luckily our story got picked up as like, wow, there's this cool, interesting tech adjacent mattress sleep company. What is this? Why are there 5 founders? Oh, interesting. It's a new product. One of the co-founders worked at IDEO. Like we kind of tried to figure out the story and how it would resonate. And then over the course of that first month, we also kind of just tried to lean into continuous storytelling. So, and then the thing is that once you have a shortage and the word starts to get out there, it tends to snowball, right? And so we ended up doing almost $1 million in sales, I think, in our first month.
Wow. And when you mentioned you hired somebody to head PR, marketing, and all those other departments, but you didn't hire somebody in logistics. Why was that?
I did a lot of that. Now, what did I know about how to do that? Nothing. So I would say we just, kind of figured it out together. Now, part of it's because part of our business model, which we didn't realize, we kind of architected, but it was also a bit lucky, was that our mattresses were actually made in the United States. Now, when you make products in the United States, the thing most people don't realize is most of the manufacturers here will drop ship products. So unlike having to import them from China, where you have to pay them bulk order when they actually leave China, which ties up a lot of your cash, and you have to order 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 at a time, we could order them one-off from our factories. And then because we had designed the box to exactly fit within the UPS specifications, our products would actually just get made at our factory in Georgia. We'd slap a label on them, and then they would ship them direct to our customer via UPS. So whereas normal companies had to set up this whole logistics infrastructure and trucks and drivers and other people, we could just rely on UPS to do most of our deliveries.
And when you sold $1 million of mattresses in 30 days, what was that inflection point where you were able to sell 139 beds on day one and eventually do $1 million in revenue in 30 days? I'm sure that's a lot of entrepreneurs' dreams, but what did you do to get to that point?
Oh, I mean, I think it was just being aggressive about earned media and then following up with paid media. And the thing is figuring out the interplay between those two. So we'd always at Casper, and that was an important skill we learned in that month and that carried through the whole time, was trying to figure out how you can amplify your message with both earned and paid media, right? And they serve different purposes. Earned media is often about credibility, about figuring out how do you get in front of people when they're maybe not in the mindset to buy something. And paid media is often about finding people who are currently in market. Now, the thing about mattresses is not that many people wake up in the morning and go, oh yeah, today's a good day to buy a mattress, right? Usually there's something happening in your life. You're moving into somebody's house, out of somebody's house, you're going to college, you're moving out of your parents' house. There's usually some life event that's happening. And so a lot of what we spent our time on was thinking through how could we figure out how to tap into those life events and make sure that we're present right there when you need to. Now, look, the second thing is the amazing thing about having an expensive product, like our product was $850 to $1,000, is like you only have to sell 1,000 beds. So like, okay, are there 1,000 people that we can find that could buy our product in a month? Now that I look back on it, it's like, it's not that impossible to think about, right? You're like, okay, if I called up 50 people every day, could I sell 1,000 in a month? Maybe, right? And so I think actually it wasn't so implausible, but to be fair, a lot of things had to go right at the same time.
And how did you tap into those life events that people were having?
So over time, it was a lot of marketing partnerships, right? In our first year, we did things like we partnered with Uber so that in New York City, there was like a little Casper button, and then you could call a Casper van that would show up at your house. And inside of that van, we had built a little bedroom where you could go try out the product. And so instead of opening our own showrooms at the beginning, you could get a showroom on demand. We'd also think about advertising. So we partnered with people who were doing these like mailers to your house when you actually move. And so we figured out that like, okay, right when you're about to move, when you change your address, that's probably a good time to message to you because you're going to be in the market, right? We'd partner with colleges and figure out how do we get things to you. And so a lot of it was just like on a whiteboard, you map out the user psychology of like, what is the exact journey? And then you try to figure out what are all of the different points at which you can go and find those people. The second thing we did for marketing, and I think a lot of marketing is honestly about arbitrage. It's like, how can you figure out how to get your message to people where other people aren't talking as much, or to different people who aren't being reached today? So one of the things that we were just early to was figuring out how to advertise on the radio and in the subways and offline. And so early days, we'd advertise on these like radio shows that nobody had ever heard of. And what we realized is that these radio hosts, when they would talk about how amazing Casper was to their audience in like Oregon or like places that were outside of New York City, they would crush it. Their sell-through rates would be incredible. And while a lot of our competitors were just advertising in like, the traditional New York and San Francisco, we realized like there's just like so many people outside of the core demographic that you expect that could buy your product. And so you should really target more broadly in other places too.
In some of those paid advertising campaigns, one of which I remember when I was doing some research for the show, started with sleep like a narcissist. So definitely not traditional corporate messaging there. And I think we see a similar thing with like a lot of successful companies that break into old industries. For example, I believe The Hustle with Sam Parr, his welcome email is like kind of a story of you diving into the office, all the hecticness going around the office, not like, hey, thanks for subscribing. This is what we do. What do you think that says about how we should think about marketing?
I think you have to be creative, and you've got to figure out how to do things differently. I mean, look, how many marketing campaigns can the average person ever remember? I bet it's less than like one handful, right? And so what that means is that breaking through the noise is really hard. And these days, when everybody's complaining about how CACs are really high and LTV is always an issue, what they're inherently saying is it's hard to break out from the noise, right? Because running traditional advertising campaigns, just everything blends in together, right? So what we realized when it comes to that one is that nobody was advertising on the New York City subways. And if you ride the subway back then, the only ads you would see are for these like dermatologists who pop your pimples and like really weird stuff. Like there were no cool brands advertising on the subways. So we met the person who does the advertising and we said, you know what, maybe this could be interesting. You have a captive audience. They have to sit opposite this advertising for a meaningful amount of time. And maybe we could be a little bit controversial. And so we started to put ads on, and then they started to work. And so then we realized, well, what else should we do? So then we started launching puzzles where we actually put on either word games or other puzzles that people could solve. And what happened? They weren't really necessarily always about our product, but everybody would start talking about them because they'd go, oh man, did you solve that puzzle for that, that game? So what happened is we turned an advertising unit, which was kind of bad, into one that was much cooler, that ended up having a captive audience that then people would actually start talking about natively. And so the extension was a lot further than we expected.
And in terms of that balance between paid and earned media, how do you find a balance between the two?
I would say, look, earned media is much harder to control, right? it's everybody wants to get in front of a journalist and say, tell my story. I'm really important. But the hard part is like the most important thing is you have to be doing something interesting. If you're doing something interesting, then downstream of that, getting your story to be told to other people is much easier, right? And so I'd say the first thing to invest in is to make sure that you actually have an interesting story that's packaged for people. It's like we were talking about earlier, right? Like people want to be told the story in a way that they can package it and retell it to their audience. And so putting in that work up front is really important. The nice thing about paid media is that it's really under your own control. And if you can figure out how to dial it, then you can have a little bit more ownership over your own destiny, because if you want to have a big month for a certain reason, you could turn up the marketing. If you are out of, inventory, you can turn it down. And so there's like a little bit more control over your end destiny. But I think they're very synergistic and you kind of have to do both.
And I think one inflection point for Casper and your growth was when Kylie Jenner posted on Instagram of a Casper mattress. What was happening behind the scenes after that post went live, and how did that affect you guys?
Oh my gosh. So this is a good story about earned media. Here's the thing. Every time you have a big earned media moment, generally for us, we would see a step change difference in business. And it's kind of weird because you can't figure out why. Like, why did we suddenly go, I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's say for easy math, how did we go from doing $100,000 a day in revenue to $130,000 a day? And then all of a sudden it just like levels off at that new number. And so you're like, okay, interesting. Like, I guess more people just know about us. So what happened there is that we had hired a head of business development who lived in LA. And we realized at the time that there were tons of celebrities and influencers who kind of wanted to get into the tech industry and wanted to collaborate with tech companies. Nas was doing angel investing, the Kardashians were doing stuff. And so we had figured out that Kylie was buying a new house and actually needed a bunch of beds for it. And so we gifted her a few beds for it, with the understanding that when she posted a picture about her new house for the first time, that there would be a Casper box in the background. And that one post broke our website. We ended up doing millions of dollars in sales in the following few days afterwards, which is incredible. We could never have imagined that that would happen to us. But in a way, it's because the authenticity of the story aligned with what happened, right? Everybody was interested in her new house. She was somebody who really loved her home, and everybody was kind of expecting like, oh, like I want to hear about your new house. What's going on? And the way she talked about the brand was in a very loving way. And so like when it all came together, it wasn't an advertisement. It was like, oh, this is just like a representation of who she is relative to her audience. And so I think that's part of the reason it worked so well, was that it didn't feel like a sellout move.
How can entrepreneurs find opportunities like you did with Kylie?
So this is a hard one because you have to put in the work to figure out who cares about what, how do you get access to those people, and how are you relevant at the right moment in time, right? Because everybody's seen those deals where if you go to somebody's agent, they might ask you for millions of dollars to sponsor or to join or something. And those definitely work sometimes. But if you're talking about this kind of deal, you have to be in the flow of knowledge. And so for one, find people who are, right? Find an advisor or find a person who seems very well networked that can help you tap into the flow of things. Two, just show up, right? Actually figure out, how do you get into LA, or how do you go to these places where people are and start trying to talk to people in person? And then the last one is, I think the strategy today would be a lot different, right? In the era of micro influencers or places where, it's not like the classic celebrities are the biggest movers of product anymore. I would figure out, go on TikTok, go on Instagram, go message these people directly, talk about how you're the founder of a company, you're really excited about what they're doing, try to set up a meeting. But like, there's no excuse for just doing the work,
And I mean, at the time you were disrupting the mattress industry, I'm sure traditional mattress companies are starting to take note of what you guys were doing. What kind of moat did you build so that traditional mattress companies couldn't go direct to consumer and just take you out of business?
So we got lucky in that sometimes when you have oligopoly industries, you actually have a lot more air cover than you think. So the mattress industry was an oligopoly in the sense that you have mattress stores who sell product that are generally not made by them and are not their own brands. And then you have the brands like Tempur-Pedic or, Sealy or Serta, who generally don't have their own stores and they have to sell through the stores. Now, what happens is that means that the mattress stores are not going to launch their own brands because they need the product from Tempur-Pedic. And Tempur-Pedic generally is not going to go and open 3,000 stores because they need the distribution of the mattress stores. So what happens is you have an industry where both are not going to encroach on each other's territory. So now what happened is that when we came in as a third party that said, actually we can do both, it was actually years before they took notice, because I think at the beginning they were like, nah, that's never going to be a big thing. That's cute. But like we have a $100 million business and they're not going to eat into it. And so I would say we were able to fly under the radar for 3 or 4 years before they started taking us seriously. And before they started thinking about, okay, structurally, how can they start fixing some of the problems that they had? The second one that we really focused on is customer service and customer experience. Like we were religiously focused on how can we continue to innovate on that customer experience, because that's something they can't do. So we invented the concept of the 100-night trial. Today, if you try a product on the internet and you get 100 days to try it, originally we had 40 days and we'd say you could try it out. We looked at the return data and we saw that actually most people don't really return the product after 40 days. So why don't we just extend the return policy? So we invented a number. We're like, 100 days sounds good. We launched it and we actually saw that return rates went down. And so we said, you know what, this is amazing. We should just be more customer friendly and allow people more time to try the product. And now that's been widely adopted across most of e-commerce, where you can often try a product for 100 days. We also had very good customer service. Even at the beginning, you could call us on a Friday night, and when we had a small team, it was my phone that would ring or our head of CX's phone that would ring. And I still remember I've, done thousands of customer service tickets where they could call us and we would respond to them. And I think being really close to the customer was really important, because it made those people feel like they had a say in our business, right? Like they were helping us build it as we went along, and they were kind of coming along for the journey. And so you can end up building these really excited advocates for your brand that are going to go and tell lots of other people about it by building that community.
I was listening to this interview with, I think, Ben Francis. So he's the CEO of Gymshark. And he said, as an entrepreneur, people don't often talk about this enough, but you have to completely change who you are as a person throughout the growth of the business. Did you encounter something similar? And if so, how did you change throughout the growth of the business?
It was probably the hardest growth I've ever had to go through. When we started Casper, I think I was 22. And when I left, I was a bit over 30, maybe 31. And so I was going through 2 growth curves at the same time. I was going through the curve of going from, responsibility, growing up, becoming more of an adult. And in one way, I felt very lucky because there was a lot of responsibility at a very young age. And so I think when responsibility is thrust upon you, you sometimes just have to step up to the challenge. What did we know about managing hundreds to thousands of people? Nothing. But we had to go figure it out. I think we got really lucky in that a core value of ours was to try to hire people who were smarter and more experienced than us almost all the time. And so we wouldn't consider it a success if we were the smartest people in the room. We always said we want there to be people who are smarter and more experienced around us, because we recognize that we don't know everything. And so I consider that to be a free education. I got to go learn from some of the best people, marketing people, finance people, operations people ever, who came from some of the best companies to come join us. And then, the other hard part is your business goes through so many cycles of being amazing and then not working and then amazing and not working. And that everyday cycle can be really hard on you. You think it's going to be so glorious all of a sudden. You think that okay, I find product market fit and now it's done. We're good forever. And I think most people don't appreciate that. I don't think your problems get any easier as you grow and scale. I think you just get better at dealing with them.
Yeah, I've noticed that's one of the big things that I've seen after interviewing a lot of successful folks is they'll generally see they still have big problems that they have to deal with every single day. It's just the way that they deal with them kind of changes over time. Um, you mentioned you scaled from hundreds of employees to near 1,000 or over 1,000. When scaling the business and scaling people, how did you get input from your employees? Did you use a 360 feedback or something similar? Or what was your process around that?
So to get feedback, we tried everything. You know, we when we s- actually until the very end, we had a Monday morning all hands meeting for the whole team. So at 12 o'clock, we'd get the entire company together from the very beginning all the way through when we went public because we felt like it was an important thing to start the week off together to talk about what's going on in the business, what's going well, what's not working, how do we have teams present their work. And so that became a very important cultural moment for the company every week. That was really important, where we could also take questions from the whole company. Anybody could raise their hand and ask about something that's going on. Over time, we started to get more sophisticated. You know, we'd do surveys, we'd have cultural ambassadors that, you know, throughout the company at different levels and in different groups who are responsible for trying to get the on the ground feedback as to what's going on, what could we be doing better. And, you know, there's nothing like FaceTime. We had offices all around the world in Berlin and London and San Francisco, New York. And so we would try to spend as much time as we could in those different offices talking to people and trying to figure out what's going on. And then later in our retail stores, like how do we go talk to our team on the ground? And I generally find that they have different kinds of value. Like surveys are really good to help you get directional feedback, but they're really hard because you lose a lot of color in what's happening. And often, if you talk to enough people on the ground, you can pretty quickly get a sense of like what's going on. You know, there's nothing like just hearing the unfiltered story. And you can also get a sense of how important is that stuff. And so we always felt like it was really, really important to have an open door policy where anybody could come and talk to us about anything.
And out of all the things that you did try to and try to get feedback from your employees, what do you think was the most effective one?
I'm not actually not sure. Yeah. I think probably talking to people one on one is the most effective one, if I'm being honest. I mean, I like the surveys, like I said, and I think that they're helpful, but I feel like if somebody has an issue, that if we have a good relationship and they're willing to say it to your face, it's something you should take seriously.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, especially when you reach, I guess, the type of scale that Casper did. Sometimes people can be intimidated by the founder or CEO in terms of bringing up their issues, but if they are able to bring those issues up, then it is maybe something that you should consider taking more seriously.
Yeah, and by the way, that's not to say that that's always perfect because I think that power dynamic definitely exists, and that's one of the things that changes as you get bigger, right? And that's the thing that I think often founders are slower to pick up on is like that power dynamic changing over time because in your head you're like, it's only been 3 years. Like, of course, I still know 50% of the people here by name on any given day, and I know most of them because I've seen them every day. But the power dynamic definitely changes over time as you get bigger, and so I think it's important if you care about that to like proactively seek that out, right? Try to form a relationship and then also showcase to the organization that if feedback is important to you, when you get it, what are you willing to do about it?
That's a good point. And I guess as you were scaling the business, what do you think was the biggest mistake you made during that scaling process?
So I think sometimes there's this idea that you can do a lot of things at the same time. And probably the big lesson I've learned is that historically, most businesses can only really do one or two things at once. And we took on a lot of complexity. We had opened up our own stores, a wholesale business. We were expanding our e-commerce business. We opened an international business in 7 countries that had all different languages. And so we had a lot of initiatives going on at the same time that were often competing for priorities. And in an environment where there's a lot of capital, sometimes that's fine. But it's really hard to unwind those things later when you can end up in liquidity crunches or when the markets change. And so I'd say like The crux of it is probably like focus, right? That's like the single most important thing. The second one is really staying true to your customer value proposition. Like really getting in there and understanding why is it that people are buying from you and how can you continue to deliver value for those people. When I think about the Casper brand, yes, we were cool, but at its core, we cared a lot about innovating on the sleep category. And I think that distribution is really important, but at the end of the day, it's still a pretty under innovated category, right? When you think about how many companies are there that are really changing the way we sleep, it's not that many, right? And so, and given that sleep is still like 8 or 10 hours or 6 hours of most people's days, I'd say on like a dollars invested per hour of your day basis is probably still one of the most underinvested categories out there.
And speaking of liquidity, you guys eventually decided to go public. How much did you guys go public for, and why did you decide to do so?
Going public was always kind of part of the plan, partly because we thought we could be a great public company. Often consumer brands do well in the public markets. It's a way for your employees to get liquidity, for your shareholders to get liquidity. It's a way for other people to join the ride with you. We had so many people that love their Caspers that were like, oh, I want to buy into your stock and like be a part of this journey as you grow. And so it was a great opportunity for all of that. And plus we also could have used the capital to help us further grow. Now, what ended up happening was that we ended up going public February 6th of 2020. And that was like 1 month before COVID happened. And so we picked, in a way, the perfectly worst timing you can imagine to go public. And so starting as a public company right in the middle of the COVID chaos was challenging for us. But yeah, I think it was always kind of like part of the plan at some point.
So I think you go public for around $1 billion. How did it feel when you guys went public at that moment?
So we actually went public at about half that valuation.
Half. Okay, gotcha.
And which was, so for first of all, it was half the valuation of our last private round. And part of the challenge then was that the markets had changed quite a lot. And it was a good lesson in terms of like the timing of the public and private markets, right? When we had last raised capital, the markets were much more tolerant of companies that were still investing and in growth mode versus being profitable. And then in September of 2019, it was like a switch flipped immediately. WeWork had tried to go public. They were not successful in doing that at that time. And basically the capital markets got closed because public investors were like, oh my God, we don't want, companies that aren't yet profitable. So it was this weird conundrum because it's really cool to go public. Obviously, ringing the bell, very interesting. You get to, it's like in all the books for entrepreneurs, it's like the dream, right? Like, oh, you take your company public, it's really cool, et cetera. But on the other side, being a public company is really hard, Like, I think the downsides people often don't talk about are the stresses of having to deal with the quarter to quarter expectations and managing how do you deal with the long-term investments that you want to make to reinvent your company and the short-term pressures around profitability and, responding to the street and to analysts, and managing that, plus the fact that like now often your team or the outside world can reduce your entire existence onto one stock price, which is often not even reflective of all the amazing things that are happening. That part's hard.
So would that mean after you guys went public, was your day-to-day more difficult than when it was when you were private?
I would say for our executive team, it was partly because, so for one, there's just like a lot of now access controls to information. You can't tell the whole team about everything. You want to protect people from having, MNPI, materially non-public information. you can't really put out forward-looking statements. You can't talk publicly about a lot of the things that you're going to do. So like there's just like a lot of restrictions in place. You have a lot of more admin burden, right? Your accounting has to get done, your forecasting has to get done. And so like I would say that there's probably a 10 or 20% drag to time of being a public company that you just like lose because of the admin related stuff. Um, and then I think there's just like the team management, right? There's like the stress involved with managing a team who sees their net worth going up and down on a public ticker every day. And perhaps yesterday they could afford that house they really wanted, and today they can't. And there might be nothing you can do to control that.
In terms of entrepreneurs who might be wanting to go public or build that big company like you guys did, what would be your one piece of advice to them?
My main advice would be don't go public just because you think it's cool. Like, really have a plan. And what I mean by that is take a step back and think about the why. I think what's amazing is these days we actually have examples of companies like Stripe and SpaceX that have gotten really big without ever having to go public. And they've figured out the mechanism by which they can operate as private companies, still have quite a lot of air cover, and without having to go public. Now, that said, there are not that many companies that are like them. The vast majority of companies access the public markets to get capital, to get liquidity and whatnot. So I'd start by thinking about like, what's your long-term plan? Why do you need this? Is it because you want money secondary for yourself? Is it for your team, for your employees? Do you need capital to help you fuel the growth of your business? Number two, think about timing. Don't kid yourself when it comes to where you are in the maturity of your business plan. And generally, I wouldn't recommend going public when you're in the middle of trying to reinvent yourselves, because the public markets like consistency, right? They like a story where it's like you told them you're going to hit this number and then you beat it by just a little bit every time. If you beat it by a lot every time, like what happens with NVIDIA and stuff, right? Then all of a sudden they bake in crazy expectations and then you can miss that. And if you miss it, it's a disaster, right? Because they're like, you can't predict your business well. And so be really clear about where you are in that cycle, and don't be flippant about it.
After your time at Casper, we're now sitting here a couple of years later. What are you focused on now? What do you want the next 5-10 years of your life or work life or personal life to be spent your time on?
Yeah, so a lot of my focus now is thinking about the consumer applications of healthcare and AI. So through the Casper journey, what I realized is sleep is really important, obviously. And then thinking about what else can we do to optimize people's health and wellness. So I joined the board of this company called PsychHub, where what we were doing was helping train therapists to specialize. And the idea was if we specialize therapists, they can become a lot more powerful at helping people get better faster by training on specific modalities or disease states. I invested in a bunch of companies in the health tech space. And then I started to realize that in the realm of mental health, there's like 100 to 1,000 to 1 shortage of how many providers there are for how many people that need help. And like we all have this, right? We all have friends who probably have gone through crisis, maybe family members who are really struggling. And not only is getting access to care really expensive, it can be hundreds of dollars an hour if you don't have insurance, and a lot of insurance plans don't cover a lot of sessions. Not to mention that for the other 7 billion people who don't have access to this care, they essentially have nothing today. And then if we believe that AGI is coming soon and that so much of our meaning in life comes from our work and our purpose and our family, and then that over the next 20 years is going to change in a big way, right? If I've been trained as a lawyer or doctor or a writer or a movie, filmmaker, and that all is going to change, I think the number of people who are going to need help processing and figuring this out is going to increase quite dramatically. So I'm starting to work on that, is thinking through, what are the applications? How can we build AI tools that are going to help people free their minds for this, this big next chapter of change?
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about what you're working on after the show. But before we wrap it up, I like to close traditionally with 2 closing questions. One of which is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
The best piece of advice I've ever gotten is to relentlessly invest in yourself. I'm not a type of person that buys fancy things. I think I learned early on that the only person who's going to believe in you as much as you do is you and your mom, probably. And so, like, you have to figure out how to gain knowledge, to gain skills, to try things. Like, you are a knife and you are responsible for sharpening your own knife. Nobody's going to do that for you. And so do whatever the hell it takes, right? Find mentors, go read books. Like, we live in an era where you can learn anything. And the cool thing about being young is that anybody will talk to you, right? Like, I talk to lots of people who cold email me who are, 16 or 18, or we met, outside of a conference. And so I think that use that to your advantage in terms of figuring out how to build your skill set. And so you could take your own destiny under your control.
I think that's a great piece of advice. And I guess our last one here is, if I slid you over a phone and you could call your 18-year-old self, would you call? And if so, what would you say?
I would definitely call. I think about this all the time when I talk to my inner child. Although I guess 18 perhaps is not a child, but maybe I was a kid. I don't know. I think I would say, like, keep doing what you're doing. The thing is that I could not have predicted for you how things were going to go this way. Like, for me at 18, I had to go to college. I had to drop out of med school. I had to start 3 companies that went sideways. Then I had to happen to sit next to somebody who became a friend and then a business partner. And then I had to go through that whole journey. And so, like, there's so much of life, we look for this linear path because it's how our brains work, that we think, all right, if I do this, then this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen. But most of the most incredible things that have ever happened in my life were either chance or I could never have written the movie script that way. And so I just tell myself, like, keep believing.
Awesome. We'll love to hear it. First off, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning into the episode. We'll have a link to Casper in the episode description down below. And thank you, Neil, for taking the time to join the show. It was a pleasure, and look forward to maybe having you back on when you announce your new startup to the public.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you.